I've made a lot of videos in my day, some would say too many, and they would be correct. But one thing that I've hardly ever touched on directly is the community aspect of making video games. Past just, mentioning sales figures, general fan sentiment, and my personal thoughts on the industry, there's so much more that I've never gotten to, like mods. You probably know what mods are already. They're modifying files which can add things like custom skins, better texture packages, and fundamental improvements to options and gameplay. They've managed to push certain games well past their prime, and have improved the quality of a ton of games on PC for years, but the industry often isn't very fond of them. There have been multiple instances of mods being banned or attempts to create a storefront around them so that the company can benefit from fan passion and almost exclusively unpaid labor. But then there's other things like preserving games through things like emulation, a bit of a gray area when it comes to how exactly you're acquiring the ROMs for these games, but oftentimes it's the only way for people to experience old titles that have been discontinued on consoles that have been discontinued, apart from just insanely overpriced secondhand copies which only line the pockets of the resellers and not the original developers. Despite the good they can do though, the industry often isn't very fond of them, constantly taking down software that can be used for emulation and insisting people avoid emulating games at all costs, even when there's no legal way of procuring the games in question unless you woke up one day and became the CEO of money. Entirely brand new video games can also be spawned off community work. Dota began as a mod for Warcraft 3 and eventually led to the creation of hidden indie gem League of Legends, and Sega actually took notice on a small dev project that created a brand new engine to recreate old Sonic games, and they wound up hiring the team to make what became Sonic Mania, the only ubiquitously praised Sonic game since the ones this team had been set upon emulating. These are usually outliers though, since the industry often isn't very fond of their IP being used without their permission, even on free projects, and they've tried to block or make money off. You know what, I'm noticing a pattern here. But there's one type of community development effort that I find more interesting than any other. It might not have as much direct impact on improving or preserving games as what I've mentioned so far. In fact, it doesn't necessarily improve anything at all. It's usually a copyright claim waiting to happen and comes with the highest chance of those who worked on it making zero money off it. It's essentially a collection of all of the dog shit Infinity Stones, not to mention it takes an immense amount of effort and creativity to pull off in the first place, but that all makes it arguably the purest form of flattery, of showing appreciation to not only the specific game that's being targeted, but to the history of video games in general. Demakes. One of the earliest demakes that I could track down was Rockman 7 for the NES, or Famicom if you're nasty. Rockman 7, also known as Mega Man 7, was released for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, also known as the Super Famicom, in 1995. The SNES system itself came out in 1991 after its predecessor, the non-Super Nintendo Entertainment System, had run its course. And then all the way in 2007, at which point games looked like this and consoles looked like this, a group of fans released a version of Rockman 7 that mimicked the look and hardware constraints of the Nintendo Entertainment System. By 2007, we were already in the Wii generation, but instead of modernizing this game for new consoles, the team took a game from 3 generations prior and optimized it for a system 4 generations prior. That's like if somebody turned Spider-Man 2 into a black and white silent film for some reason. The game didn't actually run directly on the NES, you couldn't just put it on a cartridge and stick it into your console to play it, but it did do everything in its power to match the constraints of an actual game designed for the older system. This wasn't just a new coat of paint, or an old coat of paint, I guess. It only used the 54 colors found in the NES's color palette, fit every sprite into the 8x16 pixel limit, matched the NES's native resolution, used a 5-channel sound chip as opposed to the SNES's 8-channel chip, cut the file size by around 75% to fit within the memory limit for a typical NES game, and even altered certain enemy behaviors and level layouts that were too complex for the limited processing power. They managed to take a larger, more advanced game and give it not only a retro style, but turn it into a true blue retro experience, a reimagining of the same game, but if the devs had decided to make it 5 to 10 years earlier. This is a process that gets both easier and harder as time goes on, with the tools and understanding of old hardware becoming easier to study and emulate, but with games also advancing at a rapid pace, meaning that depending on what game you're transporting over to which era, you have to make more radical changes to design, like the common demake practice of converting 3D titles into 2D. Of course, you can just cut corners wherever you'd like, who's gonna stop you? For example, some people opt to work with audio files that the hardware they're trying to demake to couldn't actually support. But the true challenge and essence of a demake is to stay as true to the constraints of the time period as possible. console. Which begs the question, why would anyone actually do this? Why go through the trouble of taking on such a huge undertaking, a job that in some ways is almost as hard to do backwards as it can be to do forwards with remakes, when you have no real financial incentive and your goal isn't to push the boundary, but to let the boundary push you? Obviously, nostalgia plays a huge part in it. It's undeniably cool to see how a modern idea would have looked like in an older generation, and it makes you wonder how much the era a game was made in contributed to its success. There's also an enticing challenge on the developer's end to see how they could maintain a game's identity while stripping away potentially key elements like more robust control schemes or complex enemy pathing, and a curiosity from the player to see how those things affect the experience. As a developer, learning how to work with less is an incredibly important skill to hone, and as a player, a demake can shine a light on key elements of modern gameplay that can make a significant difference. If you play a game that's equal in concept and gameplay style to one that you love, but it's missing certain quality of life elements, you start noticing just how important those elements actually are. And plus, it's just a fun challenge to reimagine your favorite game in a style that you're familiar with or nostalgic for, like Jasper Byrne's transformation of Silent Hill to a 2D survival horror game called Soundless Mountain 2. Just a bulletproof defense against copyright allegations. Speaking of copyright, that's one of the biggest external hurdles that a demake creator can face. One of the more complete versions of a demake that I've seen that's also been pretty well documented is Portal N64, a demake of Portal designed to run on, you guessed it, the Sega Saturn. Portal N64's progress was detailed on the creator James Lambert's YouTube channel, and it aimed to bring the full Portal experience, including cutscenes, lighting effects, and even localized audio and subtitles, to Nintendo's 1996/1997 N64 console. And it did just that. Until Valve strongly suggested that James take the project down. Interestingly, Valve didn't seem to care much about its own IP being used in this way. In fact, they've been pretty consistently pro-creator design choices for a long time. The problem really came from the N in N64 because it stands for Nintendo, and Nintendo stands for nothing its fans do. The project required James to use Nintendo's official dev kit for the N64, Lib Ultra, and Valve was worried that knowingly allowing a Valve IP to exist on something that was built using a Nintendo SDK would cause Nintendo to take certain actions. James basically confirmed as much, saying, "It makes sense that Valve would have to tell me to stop the project after finding out it uses Lib Ultra, because while I might not be a big enough target for Nintendo to come after, Valve is. So if they put their stamp of approval on the project, then that could be grounds for Nintendo to come after them." Demakes are a really risky move. Trying to sell them for profit is basically a death sentence, but even free versions are liable to a level of crackdown if you hit the wrong person's radar. It's absolutely insane that James spent so much time trying to perfect the Portal N64 experience, only to have it disappear in an instant because of factors outside of his control. Although to his credit, he doesn't seem too bothered by it. He largely accomplished what he set out to do, the game lives on in memory, and he has the logs to show how well it came out. Like a lot of community projects, this is really only intended for a small group of dedicated fans of the game, but that doesn't mean they can't become cultural moments in their own right. In fact, probably the most popular demake to date, and the one that introduced me to the concept, was covered by a ton of major outlets and online creators. And I guess it's fitting that the most popular version of a game where everything is roughly the same but a little bit worse takes place in a setting where everything is the same but a little worse. England. I like to think that Sony ordered a remake of Bloodborne and some intern just read it wrong and we ended up here. They took so long to make a Bloodborne remake that somebody said, "Fine, I'll make it worse myself." I know I keep saying make it worse, but I say that affectionately because Bloodborne PSX is a wonderfully made demake from Lilith Walter, and it manages to capture the heart of Bloodborne while trying to portray it as realistically as possible through the lens of the original PlayStation. There's more limited draw distances, low poly 3D models, and maybe most impressively, she managed to get the frame rate even lower than the original, which I didn't even know was possible. The game does have some extra quality of life features like the option to change resolution and controls, which takes away a little bit from its authenticity, but also allows for a much wider group of people to experience the core aspects of a demake like this. Bloodborne PSX covers the whole early section of the game up until Father Gascoigne, because doing all of Bloodborne in this style would likely take an insane amount of time, be more prone to Sony taking it down, and honestly might just lose its charm over time, since if you're gonna dump 30 to 60 hours into the game, it kinda doesn't make sense to do it like this if this still exists. But the vertical slice that was put forward here is enough to inject a double-decker of nostalgia cake into one experience. And since its release, Lilith and her team have worked on and released another game related to the franchise, Bloodborne Kart. No, seriously. Bloodborne Kart was a long-standing meme in the community where the salivation of any kind of follow-up to Bloodborne turned into excitement for a fictitious upcoming kart racer spin-off. And fittingly, given the retro style of Bloodborne PSX, the retro tactic of actually following up a successful game with a kart racer has now been implemented here, although Sony did ask for their branding to be removed. Regardless, it eventually released, it's now titled Nightmare Kart, and it looks like a genuinely comprehensive experience with multiple characters and maps. It's one of the weirdest fan projects ever, and it's a true reflection on just how much time, effort, and passion people can put into games without any regard for compensation or widespread recognition. And it also represents an interesting side of retro gaming that isn't necessarily the most user-friendly or marketable, but represents retro in its truest form. The love for old games is everywhere, in emulators, in remakes of old titles, in Game Boy Advanced era games that are just now releasing exclusively on the Game Boy Advanced, in the rise of boomer shooters, and the classic pixel art aesthetic of thousands of indie games. And for an industry where preserving the past is harder than really any other form of media, it's really nice to see community-led efforts do their best to keep it alive, even when it comes with a level of risk and likely lack of attention in all but the most fringe of cases. If you want to check out a couple of demakes, I'll put their links in the description, try them out yourselves. It's pretty crazy to see how some of them turned out. If you've played any that didn't show up in this video, I'd love to check them out myself. Leave them down in the comments. Also join the Discord, it's in the description, and I'll see you all next time. Peace.